Hi guys, and thanks Dave for the intro. So I've been given the very unfair task of trying to condense the year of hyper casual into a 15-minute talk. So really my goal of this talk is just to give you a slight taste of what's to come in 2019 in terms of casual games in the East. So my name is Jeppe, and at this point I'm a mobile games veteran with more than 10 years of experience in the business, so don't be fooled by the fact that I look like an 18-year-old. I've worked a bunch in production and publishing over the years, and I was with another Danish company for 9 years or so called Kaloo, and helped that company transition from 10 to 100 plus people. So I got my entire career on mobile and in casual games. I've worked on a bunch of games. Probably the most well-known one at this point, and the one that always comes up, is Subway Surfers by Kaloo and Cyber Games. So one of the key casual games in the industry. So who is JoyPac? So JoyPac is a mobile games publisher with offices both in the West and in the East, so in Copenhagen and in Beijing. And our entire focus is to bring hyper-casual and casual games from the West, from Western developers to China and to APAC. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, specifically the hyper-casual trend that we predict in Asia and in China specifically. So I'd like to start out by wishing everyone a Happy New Year. And I know it's been a while now since 2018 wrapped up in the West. Essentially, every year wraps up by everyone making the predictions for 2019 or for the next year, essentially. And if you look back at 2018, China accounted for nearly 50% of all downloads across iOS and Android. It also means now that the new year is really starting in China now. The Spring Festival is right around the corner. And in China, that essentially means a very abrupt change to something new. So it's something that signifies a completely new shift. I'm kind of using this as a metaphor for what's going to happen in the market, according to us. Fireworks. So essentially, we believe that 2019 would be the year of Western casual games in Asia. And I don't want to talk too much about hyper-casual, really. There's a number of talks around it here at PGC. It's been everywhere in the media for the past year, 2 years or so. It's been one of the hottest trends of mobile. But essentially, the way that I like to sum it up is that it's a playground for studios that has a very rapid release pace. So one example, of course, is Voodoo, a French publisher. They're kind of the prime, the prime studio in the business. But essentially, they had 18 out of the top 100 titles in June of 2018. And what that really signifies is that this is a market where there is a tremendous amount of pace. So there's new gameplay, new meta games coming out, new business models, new advertising. It's essentially a market that moves tremendously fast, and you have to be at the forefront of that. You have to be a studio that's very used to delivering content at an extremely high rate, and that's why it's been able to take over the mobile space in a very short amount of time. Really, hyper-casual is something that grew as mobile advertising matured, and that's both on the acquisition side and on the monetization side. It grew out of a trend in the market where essentially it got more and more expensive to acquire players. And what happened with hyper-casual players, according to Tencent in 2018, is that it's between 7 to 13 times cheaper to acquire hyper-casual players. So what does that tell you? Well, it essentially tells you that you are able to grow games to an extreme amount, right? You're able to drive a high amount of players into your game, and while still monetizing them through advertising. And mobile advertising is something that's essentially matured a lot over the last 1 to 3 years, more or less. And you've seen new formats arise, so of course everyone knows about incentivized videos and the way that you've been able to monetize that in games. But simultaneously, you've also seen on the acquisition side that new formats like interactive ads, the way that we've seen on the screen right now, are able to really put the tutorial of the game in the advertising and ensure that the player is on a journey right from when they see the ad to when they download the game and start playing. So really, hyper-casual goes hand in hand with mobile advertising. There's really nothing new about casual games on mobile or hyper-casual games on mobile or very trend-based games on mobile. It's something that's been around now. I've been working in mobile games since 2009, and I've been working on a game that was predominantly ad-driven in Subway Surfers, a very casual game. So we've seen this cycle again and again, also with a game like Flappy Bird that you just saw, which is essentially that a game takes over the presence in the player's mind for a short amount of time. So what has really changed is the fact that it's become a business model, something that you can actively make a business out of. So what's next for hyper-casual is what I really want to talk about, because right now there's a bunch of predictions about hyper-casual, what's going to happen at the next stage, because in 2018 what you saw is a high amount of publishers starting out in the West and new games coming out every week that was essentially striving for people's attention. So what I'd like to argue is that there's a foundation being built in China, and originally I wanted to talk about the entirety of Asia, but it's just simply not enough time in a 15-minute talk. I'd love to talk more with anyone that has questions about this, but right now we believe that there's a foundation coming and being built in China that will allow for hyper-casual games and casual games from the West to transcend into China much better. So traditionally, when you look at China and Asia, it's a region of culture and tradition. Historically, it has been a very core market. This is both because China specifically grew out of a PC games idea, and free-to-play was a business model that was around much earlier than it was in the West. So these core genres such as MMORPGs or MOBAs or SLGs have really allowed the Chinese players to play a very competitive, very core games. So traditionally we haven't really seen casual games do that well in China. And as you can see, it's actually a matter of these games being, even on a global level, these core games have been tremendously successful. So 68 out of 100 of the top grossing titles in 2018 came from Asia. So I typically like to sum up and say that Chinese players are very competitive. So it's in the Chinese nature that they like to compete. So whether that's leaderboards or event-based metagame where you're competing against your friends, really Chinese players love to compete. So hyper-casual games are casual games that have some kind of competition has a much better chance of succeeding in Asia and in China specifically. There's also another very important factor to keep in mind when you're dealing with China, and it is that Chinese players love to immerse themselves in games. So a lot of statistics show that Chinese players, they don't play as often as Western players do, but they play for much longer stretches of time when they play. So it's extremely important that you have a game that's able to both monetize and be played in like extreme sprints. So they're extremely immersed when they play. And finally, Chinese players are inherently social, whether that's through WeChat or Sina Weibo or whatever social media. Chinese players love to spread their content in socially. And that means that hyper-casual games and casual games that employs social mechanics really have a much better chance of standing out in this market. So in 2018, we started noticing a trend that more hyper-casual games were becoming chart toppers on iOS. And I'm cheating a little bit here because the China iOS market is much more closely related to the Western market, but it's still a sign of things changing somewhat in China and in Asia specifically. So one trend that was really clear in 2018 was a trend I like to call the competitive social genres. I put social in quotation marks because essentially social here is fake. It's a fake multiplayer environment, but it feels like you're competing with other players. So .io games such as Crowd City by Voodoo is something that's been doing tremendously well. You know, games where it feels like you're competing against other players. This is something that can really be successful in China, and Crowd City was a tremendous hit and still is in China. We also saw a success of very immersive physics-based puzzlers. This is Happy Glass by Lion Studios, which probably some of you know did tremendously well in China as well. It's a game that obviously has very close ties to proven gameplay mechanics both in the West and in the East, but it's also a game that has a very distinct Western feel and a very, you can kind of call it a narrative or very immersive style just in the fact of the setup in the game. Finally, we started seeing a trend of deeper, for example, idle mechanics or deeper metagame systems that allows the player to stay engaged in the game for a longer period of time, become very successful. So Hooked Inc., Visual Tycoon by Lion Studios is another game that's been doing really well in China. And these are games that allow for the player to upgrade over time, and actually, if you are a super fan of the game, you have content to sink yourself into over time. So this trend in the West is slowly rubbing off on the East as well, and that means that hyper-casual or casual is slowly starting to employ mechanics that can allow it to be successful in Asia, which means that distribution is about to be ready in Asia and China. So what is the exact opportunity for game developers in 2019? So one, lightweight games or hyper-casual games, they drive massive audience for a short amount of time. And if there's one thing that's very clear, it is that China is a trend-based country. So in China, you will very often see that a trend becomes a trend socially and spreads really fast on social media. So we believe that hyper-casual games can really be driven through that. So Chinese players are very used to a new trend emerging and a new gameplay becoming very, very popular. So if you employ social mechanics that allows the game to spread very easily, whether that's virally or just essentially through video or streaming or whatever, it's something that will allow the game to grow really fast. So hyper-casual games are really right for a Chinese audience. Secondly, if you look at traditionally going to market in China, it usually involves setting yourself up with a local partner and getting help on culturalization and localization. But if you look at hyper-casual games, typically these games don't really need a lot of localization or culturalization. They are gameplay. It is very pure, simple gameplay. It's something that transfers across borders very easily. So essentially, you don't need to translate a lot of text, and you don't need to culturalize extensively for a long period of time in order to make your game successful. So it's very easy to start distributing in different markets. I will say one thing, however, there is certain color palettes or specific gameplay types that are more suitable for the Chinese market compared to other markets. So it is something that you can keep in mind when you start out designing your game for the hyper-casual market. Thirdly, I think it's very important to make the distinction that Western casual games are very distinctly global. So what I mean by that is essentially that Chinese game studios have traditionally not been producing casual games themselves. They grew up playing MMORPGs, they grew up playing very advanced strategy games. They don't have studios, with a few exceptions, they don't have studios that are set up for really handling traditional casual games themselves. And that's an obvious investment opportunity when there's a market that's not self-sustaining. So while the Chinese game studios are excellent at building games that are excellent at building core games that are perfect for the Chinese core players, really casual games need to come from the West. So that means that there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of bringing your casual games to China. They won't be able to produce the games as it is right now themselves. And kind of the fourth point that I'd like to make is that these hyper-casual games are very closely connected with mini-games. So in the West in 2018, we also saw a lot of hype, a lot of trend around Facebook instant games. It's still going on, It's also very present in Asia in terms of WeChat mini games, QQ, Oppo. A lot of these phone manufacturers and publishers have stores of their own for mini games. And hyper-casual games are very closely connected to mini games, and it means that you can very easily transfer your game to a number of different stores, which just allows you to build an even bigger audience. So really, there's a very significant audience that you can drive through this way. So I mentioned earlier that hyper-casual games predominantly monetized through advertising. And we have to talk about the business side as well, because in my opinion, hyper-casual is nothing new. It's primarily just a matter of fact that the business around it, the advertising business around it, has started to grow significantly. So in terms of that, if we look at iOS again, the eCPM and CPI levels are really starting to mirror Tier 1 markets. And what that means is that you have an acquisition side and you have a monetization side. It's starting to be very much on a Western basis. So in 2018, for example, we saw an 80% increase in non-organic installs of Western games in Asia. So these games are starting to be advertising and marketing of these games in Asia to a much higher degree. So this really sets the foundation for developers and publishers to bring their games. And if you look at Asia in general as an area or as a territory, Asia is very used to advertising in their daily lives. If you go through any kind of city or through these major cities and you look at all the advertising, the billboards, if you take any form of public transportation, you will see advertising videos everywhere. So Chinese players and Asian players in general are much more used to seeing advertising. And since hyper-casual games monetize predominantly through ads, there's a close tie with them being very used to this aggressive advertising strategy that you see employed in the Western hyper-casual games as well. So it's something that translates really well to the Asian markets. Right now we're also seeing like a very high increase of digital advertising. It's up to 20%, which means that this is a market that's still growing, and there's an opportunity in terms of that. It's a market that's still heading up in terms of casual games, also driven by hyper-casual games on HTML5 stores. So traditionally, when you looked at the Android market in China, that's been the biggest challenge for any Western developer to reach, because you had to work through a local partner. And it's also been a challenge because the Android ecosystems were not really set up for advertising. So, of course, since you don't have Google Play, what you have instead is a multitude of different stores. And it's been an issue that these stores were predominantly only allowing advertising within the ecosystem, which means that it's very difficult to drive enough of an audience into your game. But these different stores are all starting to slowly open up for outside advertising, meaning that this is a market that can grow even more. And it's interesting, this is a list of the top 10 Android stores in China. But if you take a closer look at that list, really it's a matter of that the top 6 stores are 80% of the market. And Android is again also 80% of the total Chinese games market. So it's a matter of actually launching in the top 6 stores. That's the most important. Whether that's Baidu or Oppo or Tencent or Huawei, you really have to focus on these major stores, and this is where the growth is going to be. So I have to list a couple of challenges because I'm making it sound very rosy to go to market in China, which is commonly known as one of the most tricky markets to reach. So first of all, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the China game freeze. Most of you will be aware that for a huge chunk of 2018, it wasn't possible to launch new games in China without getting an ISBN number. And essentially this license hasn't been given out since March of 2018. It just opened up before Christmas, and it's mostly on domestic games so far, with an expectation that international games will also slowly be launching in China. But this is something that we are, of course, watching closely, and that needs to be monitored closely. When doing business in China, you are working very much closely in connection with the legislation, and it's something that will be a challenge. But essentially, I also see it as the fact that these hyper-casual and casual games that predominantly monetize through advertising are not the target of the Chinese government. Essentially, the ban was very much aimed at games that have a lot of loot box mechanisms or very heavy metagame systems, or monetize heavily through IAPs. So I believe that there will be an opportunity still to quickly get on board when using casual games, also in the HTML5 space. When I mentioned earlier that the Android stores are slowly opening up, it is also still worth noticing that Android advertising is not at the same level that we saw the iOS levels earlier. So it is still a challenge to take this portion of the market and make a significant business out of it. And you have to work through a local partner in order to work through these stores. You need to have a partner there that can help you do the business development and do the business management with these stores. So it is quite the challenge still to make sure that you can actually monetize on Android next to iOS, which is by far the easiest market to reach since it's a global market. And while we talked about earlier that China is not really good at creating casual games themselves, it is still a market that struggles somewhat with copycat competition. So essentially you will see games being copied really fast, and it can be tough to kind of isolate the original from the copycat. And this is of course a challenge because it means that you will have face competition very, very soon if you launch a game in China. But I will say this is also something that's happening in the West really with hyper-casual, where we're already seeing that the major publishers and the major developers are copying each other very, very fast. You know, this is a market that's moving tremendously fast. So while it is an issue, it is not it is primarily important to keep in mind that you need a partner that can work with the local legislation and can ensure that you have copyright of your IP in China, so that this doesn't become as much of an issue. So what is kind of the New Year's resolution for 2019? If we sum it up, everything that we've been going through so far. The prediction is that a maturing advertising market and this evolution of the meta features and the mechanic, kind of the gameplay types in casual games are building the foundation for a new trend in China and APAC. If the business side if the advertising business side grows the way that we predicted that it will and continues to grow, then there is an opportunity for Western companies to bring their games to China and APAC, working through different distribution partners. We're already seeing a significant trend in the West where more and more developers are self-publishing. And this is a way that you can actually bring your games to new emerging markets by following what is happening right now in Asia. But you need to work through a local partner and also think closely about how you design your game from the start. There are specific gameplay types, there are specific graphical styles that will appeal more to an Eastern audience, essentially. So this was kind of a very condensed deep dive into the Asian hyper-casual of 2019. I'd love to chat with anyone that has more questions about it. We have time for questions as well now. But otherwise, please reach out to me and we can discuss more about the opportunities for bringing Western casual games to Asia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, do we have a roving mic? Perfect. So if we have time for a couple of questions, maybe. Does anyone want to? Oh, we've got one down the front. Actually, I didn't see him. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk, it's really interesting. How do you charge for your services?
Sorry?
How do you charge?
How do we charge? Well, essentially, JoyPac works on a rev share business. So we take a part of the rev share and then give certain marketing guarantees when we distribute the game.
Is there another question over there? Oh, no, back there.
Hello. Thank you for the great presentation. My question is about ad monetization. How to properly monetize games on Android in China with ads?
Yeah, it's a very broad question, right? Essentially, we're still at a stage where we need the stores to open up their ecosystems even more. I think you have to work a lot closely with a partner in terms of placement of the ads and the specific type of ads that you utilize in the game. It's something I think we can talk more about afterwards, but maybe you can be more specific in terms of are you thinking about placement in terms of monetization, or what do you mean when you say monetizing on Android?
It's more about choosing partners to run monetization. Well, for Western markets, we can run like ad mediation with Iron Source, Aplan, and other games. What's the situation in China on Android?
Essentially, you still need to work through the local stores to integrate their ad SDKs, but more and more are opening up for the traditional bunch of advertising SDKs, no matter which provider you're going through.
Thank you. We probably ought to crack on with the afternoon, so maybe just one more question. I think there was one that we saw in the crowd, and then we'll probably move on after that.
Hi, great talk. You mentioned HTML5 a few times in your conversation. Do you guys have a catalog of HTML5 games that you're looking to? Do you have a catalog of HTML5 games as well that you're publishing?
Yes, we do. Yeah, and it is something that's evolving tremendously fast. So when you look at HTML5, for example, in China, 80% of the games that are live on HTML5 in the different stores right now are casual games. So this is a market that's evolving much faster, and I think typically it's also what you see that Asia is a good indication of the trends that will follow in the West as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should probably leave it there and move on. But yeah, JoyPac, thank you very much.